In November of 1910, a private rail car slipped out of a New Jersey station after dark. There was no manifest and no press. The men inside used only first names for the entire trip. When they arrived at their destination, a remote island off the coast of Georgia, they told the caretaker staff they were on a duck hunting trip. Not one of them had brought a gun. What happened over the next 9 days on Jekyll Island did not appear in any newspaper. It was not debated in any Senate chamber. It was not put to a public vote. Yet what those 7 men designed in secret would reach into every wallet, every mortgage, every paycheck, and every debt in the United States for the next 114 years. And the families behind those men? They are still there. Different names appear on some of the doors, but the same hands remain on the levers. This is not a story about a conspiracy theory. This is a story about what happens when power concentrates quietly across generations, and no one is allowed to call it by its real name. The island itself is important. Jekyll Island in 1910 was owned entirely by a private club. Membership was invitation only. Rockefellers, Morgans, Vanderbilts, Astors. The richest families in America used it as a winter retreat, a place where the rules of public life simply did not apply. When Senator Nelson Aldrich chose it for this particular meeting, he was not choosing it for the scenery. He was choosing it because nothing that happened there would leave the island unless those men decided it would. Aldrich was the chairman of the National Monetary Commission. His daughter had married John D. Rockefeller, Jr. the year before. He was not a neutral party. He was a conduit, a man positioned precisely at the intersection of legislative power and private wealth. The 7 men he brought to Jekyll Island understood that distinction perfectly. Frank Vanderlip was the president of National City Bank, the institution that would eventually become Citigroup. Henry Davison was a senior partner at J.P. Morgan & Company. Charles Norton ran First National Bank of New York. Benjamin Strong ran Bankers Trust, another Morgan operation. Arthur Shelton was Aldrich's personal secretary, the man who would make sure nothing was written down carelessly. And then there was Paul Warburg. Warburg deserves particular attention because he is the thread that connects Jekyll Island to something much older and much wider than American banking politics. He was a German-born partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He was also the primary intellectual architect of what the group was about to design. Warburg had studied the central banking systems of Europe for years. He understood how the Bank of England worked. He understood the Reichsbank. He understood that the ability to create money, to control its supply and its cost, was not merely an economic function. It was the foundation of political power. What these men produced during those 9 days was the draft legislation that would become, after some cosmetic revision, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. They created a central bank for the United States, a privately controlled institution with the legal authority to issue currency, set interest rates, and act as the lender of last resort to the entire national economy. They called it the Federal Reserve specifically because neither word in that name is fully accurate. It is not federal. It is not a reserve. Nelson Aldrich submitted a version of their plan the following year. It failed, not because the design was rejected, but because the public had grown suspicious of anything with Aldrich's name attached to it. The solution was elegant. They waited for a new administration, changed some of the language, removed Aldrich's name from the title, and passed the same essential structure under Woodrow Wilson in December of 1913. Frank Vanderlip, one of the men in that private rail car, later admitted in a 1935 interview with the Saturday Evening Post that yes, the Jekyll Island meeting had happened. And yes, it was the origin of the Federal Reserve. He said they had been as secretive as any group of conspirators. That word, conspirators, is worth sitting with for a moment. Not because it satisfies some dramatic need, but because it is the word one of the participants chose for himself. Now, here's what mainstream history would have you believe. It would have you believe that the Federal Reserve was created by well-meaning legislators to stabilize the economy after a series of banking panics. It would have you believe that the families involved were civic-minded industrialists who simply wanted a more rational financial system. It would have you believe that what happened at Jekyll Island was an unusual moment, an anomaly, a singular instance of private interest shaping public policy that has since been corrected. But what if the anomaly is the story we were told afterward? The Rockefeller family did not arrive at power in 1910. John D. Rockefeller had already built Standard Oil into a monopoly that controlled 90% of American oil refining by 1880. The Sherman Antitrust Act forced a nominal breakup in 1911, 1 year after Jekyll Island. Those successor companies, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, and Standard Oil of California, eventually became ExxonMobil, Mobil, and Chevron. The Rockefeller family maintained controlling stakes through interlocking directorships and trust structures designed specifically to survive legal dismemberment. Today, Rockefeller family interests are managed through Rockefeller Capital Management, which oversees assets in the hundreds of billions. The energy industry they seeded in the 19th century remains the structural backbone of the global economy. The Morgan line is no different. J.P. Morgan died in 1913, months after the Federal Reserve was created, but his firm survived him. J.P. Morgan and Company absorbed Chase Manhattan in 2000 to form J.P. Morgan Chase, now the largest bank in the United States by assets. The firm Henry Davison represented on Jekyll Island manages over $3 trillion today. The Morgan family's fingerprints are not on the glass anymore. They are baked into the glass itself. The Warburg connection runs deeper still. Paul Warburg's brother, Max, ran the Warburg banking house in Hamburg, which advised the German government during the First World War, while Paul's institution in New York simultaneously helped finance the Allied side. The Warburg family's banking operations continued through the 20th century, and the Warburg Bank still operates today, more than 230 years after its founding. What Tartaria teaches, what the buried history beneath the official version keeps pointing toward, is that the world we were handed is not the world that was built. Somewhere between the maps that show cities that should not exist, the architecture that requires technology no official history accounts for, and the institutional structures that persist across supposed revolutions and resets, there is a pattern. That pattern is not random. It is managed. The families at Jekyll Island did not invent the model. They inherited it. The central banking concept Warburg brought from Europe did not originate in 19th century Germany. The Bank of England was founded in 1694 by a consortium of private creditors who lent the crown $48 million in gold in exchange for a charter giving them the right to issue currency. The identity of those original creditors has never been fully made public. The institution they founded still exists. It still sets monetary policy for the United Kingdom. The names have changed. The function has not. When you look at the families connected to the Bank of England's founding, you find the same surnames cycling through centuries of European finance, through the funding of wars, through colonial trading companies, through the establishment of every major central bank on the continent. The Rothschild family alone financed both sides of the Napoleonic Wars and held the bonds of at least 5 European governments simultaneously by 1820. Nathan Rothschild said plainly that he did not care who sat on England's throne as long as he controlled the money supply. The money supply. That is the exact phrase that connects Jekyll Island to every century before it and every year after. Control the money supply, and you control the cost of everything. You control whether businesses can afford to expand or must contract. You control whether governments can fund wars or must seek permission from creditors. You control whether families can afford homes or must rent from those who can. You set the pressure inside the entire economic system, and you do it from a building with the word federal on the door and no obligation to explain your decisions to anyone who was not in the room when they were made. After the Federal Reserve was established, the families who designed it moved into the industries that would define the 20th century. The Rockefellers funded the development of the pharmaceutical industry through the General Education Board and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. They helped write the Flexner Report of 1910, which restructured American medical education away from herbal and homeopathic traditions and toward petrochemical-based drug therapies. The industries they stood to profit from were the industries their funded reports recommended. The Morgan interests spread into media and communications. AT&T, the telephone monopoly, had Morgan financing. General Electric, which eventually owned NBC, had Morgan financing. The concentration of mass communication into a small number of Morgan-connected hands happened not because of market efficiency, but because of coordinated capital deployment. By the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, the system was self-sustaining. The banking families no longer needed to sit in private railcars. Their institutional descendants, the foundations, the investment firms, the interlocking board structures, moved capital the way water moves through a pre-existing channel. The channel had been cut at Jekyll Island, in the Bank of England's founding charter, and in every financial architecture those invisible creditors had assembled across the centuries. The names you see at the top of today's financial system are not strangers to this story. BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street together hold controlling or significant stakes in nearly every major corporation on Earth, including each other. Their largest shareholders trace directly to the institutional lineages built by Morgan, Rockefeller, and Warburg money. BlackRock was built in part with capital from Schwartzman and Peterson, both of whom came out of Lehman Brothers, itself a Kuhn-Loeb affiliate in the network Paul Warburg operated within. Vanguard's structure is deliberately designed to obscure ownership. It is technically owned by its own funds, which are owned by its investors, making it a legal and corporate puzzle never fully resolved in public. What is known is that Vanguard and BlackRock are the top two shareholders in each other, in every major bank, in every major pharmaceutical company, in every major media company, and in every major defense contractor. The industry concentration that the Jekyll Island men began building in 1910 now covers almost the entire formal economy. That is not a natural outcome. Markets do not naturally produce that kind of concentration across every sector simultaneously. What produces that outcome is coordinated multi-generational capital management by institutions whose structure insulates them from political accountability. Every official history of this period will tell you that the Progressive Era was a time of trust-busting and democratic reform. On the surface level, that is partially true. Standard Oil was broken up. The income tax was passed. The Federal Reserve was created with congressional oversight provisions. But examine each reform carefully, and you find the same families positioned on both sides. Rockefeller interests held stakes in every Standard Oil successor. The income tax did not apply to income from tax-exempt foundations, the vehicle Rockefellers and Morgans were already building. The congressional oversight of the Federal Reserve has amounted to the Fed chairman testifying twice a year to legislators who receive significant contributions from the financial sector. The reform and the power structure it was meant to reform were both carefully managed by the same hands. Here's what gets buried in that history. Before the Federal Reserve, the United States had a tradition, contentious and imperfect, of resisting centralized banking. Andrew Jackson killed the Second Bank of the United States in 1833, calling it a den of vipers and thieves. Abraham Lincoln issued greenbacks, government-created currency that bypassed the private banking system entirely, to finance the Civil War. Lincoln was assassinated 6 weeks after the war ended, and the greenback system was dismantled within a decade. Whether those two facts are connected is a question historians still debate. What is not debated is the timeline. The pattern of centralization, resistance, and the elimination of that resistance runs through American financial history like a straight line. Jekyll Island was not the beginning of that line. It was the point at which the line was made permanent. What they built in 1910 has not been dismantled. It has not been reformed in any structural sense. It has only grown. The families that sent representatives to that island did not lose their position when the legislation passed. They became the legislation. Their institutional descendants define the terms on which every American, and through the dollar's reserve currency status, every human being on Earth, participates in the global economy. The hunters who never brought guns to Jekyll Island were hunting something. They caught it. And 114 years later, nothing on the menu has changed. Ask yourself how many institutions in your life were built before you were born, will exist after you are gone, and have never once asked for your consent. Your bank, your currency, the interest rate on your mortgage, the price of medication your family depends on, the news presented as objective, the candidates available to vote for, both funded by the same investment firms. None of these systems appeared naturally. Every one of them was designed in rooms you were not in, by people whose names do not appear in the textbooks your children carry. Jekyll Island is not the whole story. It is one well-documented moment when the curtain slipped. Pay attention to what was visible in that gap, because the families that sat in that room are still sitting. They just moved the table somewhere you cannot find it.